Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is the Ebi, or the lobster katana from Romance of Men. And before I get into the video, a couple quick disclaimers. One, this is a review sample. It was sent to me for free. I didn't spend any money on it. If you think that makes me biased, you know at the start. Two, I study Japanese swordsmanship. I've done so for quite a while. Still don't fancy myself an expert, though I'm getting a little long in the tooth to keep saying that. I've achieved rank in multiple martial arts at this point. Perhaps I am a little bit of an expert, but bear in mind, I still fancy myself a hobbyist. Keep that in mind as you hear my babbles and musings. The last bit that you should know is that this is a $350 sword. So this is one of Romance of Men's higher end items. $350 is still in my mind on the budget side of things, but unlike some of the $100, $150, $200 offerings that they've sent me to review in the past, this one is a little bit pricier, a little bit more expensive, and thus the expectation for it is going to be a little bit higher. Now, I'm going to go over the bits and bobs, fits and features, show you in detail as much as I can. Hopefully it gives you some idea of build quality. Then I'll use it, I'll abuse it a little bit. I'm not pushing this one all the way to failure, but I am pushing it, let's say, and you'll get to see how it holds up. After that, I'll give you my thoughts on if I think it's worth it or not, but hopefully by that point you have some idea of if it's worth your $350 or not. So without further ado, on with the reviewing. I'm going to throw in a little tidbit at the start here around the intent of this sword. So I will point out that very often I read the website to see what is the sword supposed to be made out of? What is it supposed to be able to do? Who is it targeting? And then I try to evaluate if it's doing the things that it says it's going to do in the reviews that I make. But seldom do I really harp on the story of a sword, particularly items from Longchuan that are not swords that I've custom built or had some story or method or thought process behind. And that's because very often they feel like they're pulled from the same parts bins and they're just trying to make something cool. But here I see an intent, and the website actually lists some of the things that it's going for. So it says symbol of longevity, auspiciousness, fortune. This is all the thoughts behind some of what the lobster can symbolize. They were talking about the hamon, why they chose this particular thing, the scabbard, you know, some of the plans that they had and some of the options they think are good. So I appreciate that there is thought process and intent behind this sword, and I will say that some of that actually comes through in the feeling of it as well. But if you are interested in buying a sword because it is supposed to symbolize something, then perhaps Romance of Men might have some options for you, in the sense that they seem to have some thought process behind what the sword is supposed to symbolize or encourage in your life. I don't know if that is of meaning to you, but I thought it was interesting that they put those notes in and where they came from, and I appreciated that. It seemed more like just drivel that you might read while you're pooping. This actually seemed to have a little bit of thought process behind it, and no disrespect to the folks that don't or just put on kind of more generic ad copy, but I appreciated knowing what the symbolism is in the sword, what the intent was behind it, and, well, I guess it just doesn't usually strike me as interesting, and this time it did. So I'm going to move on with the bits and bobs, fits and features, and I'm going to start with the kasha, the end cap right here. So first, we're supposed to have a lobster, and what I see on here is, well, I see a lobster, no surprise. And I want to note that the transitions here are not bunchy. Overall, it lines up well with the Ito. The fitting itself is lackluster to me. Well, it does show the lobster. It is not particularly detailed. It's also not muddy. I can very clearly outline that this is, in fact, a lobster or crustacean, at least of some kind. And the thing to note is that very often some of these details become so obscured by the tooling and recasting or just the quality of the fitting that you can't tell what they are, and you really have to stare or use your imagination. Here I don't have to. It's just that some of the lines I would imagine could be a little bit crisper. I do like that the kind of the tendrils and the lobster winds around a little bit, but then there's this kind of unused space around that gives me this machined perspective. I can't say that I mind it, but anyway, it is probably the least good part of the fittings, but nevertheless, overall, it does its job. I'd also note that I've used this sword rather intensively. It's still on here. The kasha hasn't come loose. I haven't had to do anything to re-secure it, and that deserves some praise in and of itself. The knots on here are also tight, which is going to bring me to the Ito section itself. So first, I want to give some praise where it's due. The silk quality on here feels really good, tangibly better than I often feel on swords. So whatever material they're using for this silk, it feels really good. I don't know if it's real, I don't know if it's fake, but I can tell you that it feels very solid in my hand. It looks nice. It doesn't absorb oils particularly aggressively. It doesn't stain easily. It's very nice material, and it's stayed relatively tight throughout the course of using it. The diamonds do wander a little bit, and I can kind of make out where the panels are used, which is an unfortunate visual effect that I can't say I'm really digging here, but nevertheless, the connection between me and the weapon is good. The ito is quite tight, and the silk feels really nice on my hand. It feels like a nice quality silk, which this is, again, a $350 sword, and I have to be careful because in this price point, there are a number of swords with a lot of different options that you can buy, and this one isn't particularly feature-rich, in my opinion. It's not that it doesn't include a lot for your money, but there are some things that are worth noting here. This, again, feels like a better quality of silk, and I'd imagine it had some bearing in why this sword is the price that it is. The samegawa underneath appears to be real. It's not particularly high nodule. That's not really something I expect in this price point. I actually want to draw your attention to the minuki specifically. So the casting quality is not amazing. I'm not writing home about that, but I do like that they stand a little bit proud. This is something that is tough to pull off and is a nuance and fun thing on this particular sword. One, if they stand proud very often, the ito moves around. That's not happening here, but they stand proud in a way that my fingers just go and kind of latch onto them. It gives me this extra leverage point to grab on with my fingers, and I feel more secure in the hand. It's seldom that I'm able to feel a Longchuan-based sword with this feature. I've felt it in higher-end custom swords. Very often when the minuki stand proud, the ito also wiggles around on them so they fall out or move around, or I don't feel like it's something I want to grab onto. In this case, I do, and it feels very welcome in the hand. The ito is very tight, and I like how the minuki actually stand out. It gives this sword a kind of unique feeling in my hand, and I really appreciate that. Shape of the handle, not bad. Again, I'm not a big fan of how these panels stand out. However, I like how the ska feels in my hand. I like the connection between the ito. I like the connection between the minuki, and it's a weird thing to feel different on a sword, but in this case, it stands out. I could kind of close my eyes and tell if I was holding this sword or not, which is, well, unique, at least just by the fittings on it. So I'm going to move down to the fuchi, and this is where things get a little bit messy. I'm not a big fan of the way this fuchi lines up, which is a shame. The kashira lined up really, really well, but the fuchi stands out. The kind of metal rim is rising out beyond the sword. This is just unsightly more than anything else. It's not a hot spot. It doesn't hurt. It's not particularly detrimental to using. In fact, I don't really notice it while I am using it, but it is unsightly and I guess incorrect. Now, this doesn't look intentional. It just looks like the fitting is too big. I can make some concessions when it looks like it was designed to fit this way. This doesn't. It just looks like you have a size of shoe that's too big and it's fitting on kind of weird, which is unfortunate. Romance of Men has done really well with the kashira. This is a part that most people miss and kind of flubbed it on the fuchi, which is a thing a lot of people do better, I guess I should say. But if you have to do one of them correctly, the kashira is probably the better one to do because it loosens quite often, it falls off quite often. So if you're going to put a lot of energy into doing something right, I guess I'm glad you did it on this end. I just like it to be all correct. There are not too many swords in the $350 price point, though, that do it well, to be fair. So functionally, this is all good. It doesn't wiggle. It does all the things I'd like, but it does have some visual things that I don't appreciate about the fuchi. I can make out the crustacean a little bit more. It's supposed to be a lobster. It looks like more of a shrimp, I guess, to me. Lobsters usually have the pinchy bits as far as I'm used to seeing, but could well be a lobster. Maybe it's a different... Anyway, not really the point, though. I'm going to move up to the tsuba. Here we have a lobster-style tsuba, and I happen to really like it. There's just a lot going on. The detail feels a lot crisper. It's not muddy. It has texture and dimension. It wraps around the outside. It does get a little kind of flubby around the rim, in the sense that the lobster textures don't follow all the way through consistently around it, but it does in some places, and it gives the tsuba a fair bit of dimension. Lobsters aren't the theme for me. You know, they're not as swirly as Mitsudomes, but they are swirling around a little bit here. Happen to just like it. I think it's as detailed as it needs to be, and it matches the sword pretty well. Now I'm going to move on to the habaki, and from a functional standpoint, I can tell you it does the things that it's supposed to do. It tensions about right. It doesn't fall out. The scabbard doesn't rattle. The habaki fits well. But I just don't like the look of it, which is kind of a rare thing. Quite often I say, I wish it wasn't the plain old brass habaki. In this case, I actually think I might prefer it. The details on here just resonate with me on cheap swords. It's not a bad habaki. It's not particularly poorly done. But I've seen iterations of this on very, very cheap swords, and the quality of, I don't know, casting or whatever's on here just didn't do it for me. It is points for something a little different. However, I don't think thematically it fits super well with the theme, and the casting just looks a little off. I wouldn't mind the like wavy pattern by itself, but with the moan and the kind of emulation of a two-piece habaki, it's just too far out of alignment with what it's trying to kind of reproduce, and it doesn't look particularly good to my eye. But that is purely subjective. It functions well, it fits reasonably well, and I do appreciate that Romance Event is not necessarily listening to me, but trying to do something a little different, trying to make every angle of this sword pretty. This one was a miss, at least in the habaki for me, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be a miss for everyone. Next, I'm going to move on to the scabbard. This is kind of like a bloody, swirly, ready little slurry of a mess here, and I love it. It has a satin kind of finish on it, which makes it kind of stand out as semi-shiny in the light. It's not glossy, and that means that it doesn't show fingerprints. So if you're going into the dojo and being handsy with this thing, your fingerprints don't show. It stays pretty nice looking all the time, and I think the kind of swirly red pattern is nice. Now, I believe the original intent was to have a more hand-painted scabbard with an ocean. I believe that's available on their website now, incidentally, if you want it. To me, those look a little touristy. It's not to say that they weren't done on Japanese swords historically, but I digress. It's just not for me. I actually prefer this look on the lobster sword. It doesn't necessarily remind me of a tail or anything lobstery, other than when you cook them, they turn red, but I can say that I like the look of it. I like the function of it. I like how it's tensioned. I like how it has horn parts on it, which is something that is becoming more and more uncommon. It came with a reasonably nice sageo. Sometimes $350 swords come with shoestrings that are short and don't work well. This is a simple black one, but it seems of decent quality. And overall, the scabbard has just been fun. It's not raspy. It's well made, and I like the color, and I like that it doesn't show fingerprints, and they did a good job. Now I'm going to talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part, and this is a relatively featureless blade in the sense that it has a hamon. That's something we're going to talk about, but no bohi, no particularly interesting geometry. It's a shinogi zakuri style blade, and the polish is Hayuza polish or something like that, but it shows the hamon reasonably well, but it's not crazy or anything particularly different. I believe the blade is made of T10. I'm not 100% sure. I don't really harp on the steels because I have no way of validating what they are or aren't, and it's something that people don't seem to take at face value very often, and without being able to substantiate it, I don't really harp on it too much. But I can tell you it's a differentially hardened blade. It has a lovely hamon on it, though. They call this like a grass pattern or something. To me, it reminds me of fire. It has these tendrils that stick out, and it's a pattern that you can get lost in. I find it to be very attractive. The blade itself, no fullering, no bohi, no kind of crazy or different geometry, but the hamon itself is easy to see and very, very pleasant looking. And I think on its face, I don't know if they look like the little tendrils on lobsters. They don't really look like claws to me, but anyway, I guess it's not a bad pattern to have on a lobster theme sword. Now, the other thing I will note is that this blade came very, very sharp. It had a very keen, nice edge on it, and I'll talk about cutting in a moment. Before I do, though, I want to mention the usage side of things, doing EI with it, and that was very pleasant. I was actually surprised at how comfortable this was. There are some visual things that I'm not a fan of in terms of the fuchi, and in terms of where I can kind of make out the panel lines, but in the hand, this felt great. The ito was tight. The silk felt of good quality. I noticed that on my hand. Nothing jutted out or hurt me. No hot spots of any kind. There's no sound, though, when I move it around. The lack of bohi or reinforced kasaki, where it swells out a little bit, those things usually whistle as they go through the air, and I don't have any of those here. So as a practitioner's tool, it's not bad in the hand in terms of feeling. It's not particularly heavy. It's not a light, dainty sword either. It draws and sheathes without a lot of rasp. It's relatively quiet. The parts seem good and well fit, but I can't hear it super well. So if you're looking for an audible tool, you may want to ask for this version with a bohi or something in there that tends to make it more audible. In this case, though, while I can't hear it, it moves reasonably well and didn't bind in the scabbard. It doesn't twist. It doesn't fall out of the scabbard. It's not raspy. It doesn't come out gooey. The overall experience of training with it, if that's your intention, is quite good. And I really actually like the way it felt in my hand. Holding this and kind of feeling these manuki in my hand was just a little different, something fun, and it held up actually well. So from a training perspective, those are my thoughts. Now, in terms of using it, it has a very, very keen, sharp edge, and I had no problem cutting through water bottles, pool noodles, some of the softer targets. It really just dominated those targets, and I had no complaints. When I brought it to some more aggressive things, honestly, it was holding up in terms of branches and stuff like that. So whatever hardening they're doing doesn't appear to be brittle. It's differentially hardened, though. If I smack it on my stand, I can bend the sword. It's not a super sword. It's not more durable than you might expect it to be. But in cutting harder things, the edge didn't chip or roll. It seemed to hold an edge reasonably well. It also didn't diminish on targets unless I was really intending to do it, at least until I brought it to my lawn chair. So I was getting rid of some old lawn furniture, you might say, and I wanted to reduce their size so I could put them in the garbage bin, and they're made of plastic, so a perfect chance to test them on swords. I will note that this lawn furniture dinged every single sword that I tested it on. I tested it on an S5 katana, I tested it on differentially hardened blades, I tested it on other through hardened blades. Nothing escaped consequence of cutting this lawn furniture. So I would say if you want to reduce the size of lawn furniture to put it in your waste bin, then a sword is probably not well, it's actually a very effective tool to do it, but bear in mind it may cause some damage to your sword. And that's what happened here. So the edge took some dings and rolls, and there are some chips that have come out of the edge. Now, it's not so much that it reduces the capability of the sword. It does reduce the capability. Sorry, I misspoke. It still is a weapon and very functional, and I believe I could sharpen it out, but I will have to adjust the geometry of the blade. It will change its shape given how deep some of the dings are in the sword. So bear in mind that it's not indestructible. If you're sticking to tatami mats, water bottles, pool noodles, and the like, then you're probably going to be fine. But if you're cutting more robust, hard things with it, then the edge, like a lot of other differentially hardened blades, is susceptible to breaking. So again, bear in mind the test that I did here proved to be hard on everything. I thought hard plastic would be bad, but I was surprised that just about every blade I brought it to had some pretty severe damage. So hard plastic is no joke on some of your differentially hardened edges, or any kind of edge, I guess, is the takeaway there. Sword friends, you have seen close-ups of the bits and bobs, fits and features. You've heard me talk about the build quality, talk about using it as a practitioner, talk about cutting with it, doing normal and debatably abnormal things. So hopefully at this point you have some idea if it's worth your $350 or not. It's time I answer that question though myself. Do I think it's worth the $350? The short answer is yes. And this is an interesting balance between something for a practitioner and something for a person who wants features. I've seen swords from Ryan Sword, for example, that come with more stuff. You can, for $350, get a laminated and a folded blade with an equally decent polish, with silk ito, with fittings that seem of a similar quality, but I think they give you a little bit more for your money there. At the same time, I've seen Shadow Dancer that gives you less for your money in terms of features. It doesn't seem to necessarily have the same polish for $350. It doesn't necessarily seem to have the same kind of fittings or quality of ito material, but they also give you things that are nipped and tucked better. Ito that is tight, swords that seem to fit together well and be a little bit more geared towards things a practitioner would appreciate. This is a balance between the two. There are points that I would make that seem lazy, like the fuchi. There are things that I don't necessarily like about being able to see the rim here, but it's important. It's done well where it counts. The ito is very tight, the kashiro stayed on, the blade held up really well, it draws and sheaths really, really well. And those are things that a practitioner is going to need that sometimes get missed on some other brands. So it seems to walk the line between those two things. And I think Romance and Men is finding their place here. I was not super enthusiastic with the look of this thing. It looks, I don't know. I just initially was unimpressed with the features when I saw it. But after looking into what the intent was behind the design, and after practicing with it and seeing how well it held up, I really had an appreciation for it as a practitioner, even though aesthetically it might not be something that resonates with me. So for $350, it's an easy one to recommend if those things are valuable to you. If you like things that are nipped and tucked, you like the quality ito, you want a sword that has a pattern like this, you like the look of it, then yeah, I think it's definitely a decent sword for the money. Though do be aware that there are some things that could be nipped and tucked a little better, and there may be brands that would do those better if those are things that irritate you personally, though you'll likely get less features for your money. So also, if all of the nipping and tucking that I'm saying doesn't matter at all to you, then you can spend as much money and get more features, I think, from somewhere else. This is a reasonable marriage of the two, and that's where I think it finds the most value. But I happen to be a person that appreciates both of those things, and I would say that this one it was really, really fun to move around, more so than I expected it would be. So anyway, those are my thoughts. Tip of my hat to Romance and Men for sending this my way for review. Hopefully you all found it interesting. That's all I've got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.